The clash of two worlds. What makes a society just? What is wealth? Who creates it, and who controls it? For over 2 centuries, two names have stood at the heart of this global debate: Adam Smith, the philosopher of free markets and invisible hands, and Karl Marx, the revolutionary who saw chains behind every handshake and profit. One believed that individual freedom and competition would lift all boats. The other saw capitalism as a system built on inequality, alienation, and exploitation. In this video, we dive deep into the ideas of these two intellectual titans. Not just to compare, but to confront them. We'll take their actual words, their most powerful ideas, and place them side by side in a no-holds-barred ideological face-off. Smith, the architect of modern capitalism. Marx, its fiercest critic. This isn't just about theory, this is about your life today. Your job. Your rent. Your future. As we explore their views on work, wealth, inequality, the role of the state, and the future of society, you'll see how their ideas still shape, and divide, the world we live in. And here's the twist. The debate will be narrated by one voice, switching perspectives, but leading you, piece by piece, to understand why Karl Marx ultimately has the stronger argument. Not because of ideology, but because of reality. Let the battle begin. Adam Smith asks, calm but curious. Mr. Marx, is it not natural that some inequality exists? When effort and talent are rewarded, surely it is just that some prosper more than others. Doesn't overall social progress benefit even if some have more than others? Karl Marx replies, sharply. The inequality you defend is not the result of merit, but of legalized theft. Capitalist accumulation depends on one class being dispossessed, and another class appropriating the surplus. It's not about talent, it's about who owns the means of production. The worker creates wealth but receives barely enough to survive. The difference, surplus value, is where the capitalist's profit comes from. Marx asks, with a piercing tone. Tell me, Mr. Smith, if you truly believe in liberty, how do you justify a system where millions must sell their labor just to survive, while a few live without working at all? Where is freedom if hunger forces your choices? Adam Smith responds, diplomatically. Economic freedom allows individuals to improve their conditions through work. Yes, some begin with less, but through competition and innovation, society as a whole benefits. I never denied poverty, I simply believed markets, if left alone, would gradually correct imbalances. Marx concludes, with force. Markets correct nothing, Mr. Smith. They reproduce domination. Inequality isn't an unfortunate byproduct, it's a requirement. Capitalism doesn't end misery, it multiplies it, generation after generation. In this exchange, Marx doesn't just answer, he dismantles the moral logic that attempts to justify inequality. Where Smith offers hope in the invisible hand, Marx offers a structural diagnosis. For him, freedom without economic justice is not freedom, it's disguised servitude. The role of the state. Adam Smith asks, with a tone of measured optimism. Mr. Marx, I believe the state should play a limited role in economic life. Its proper functions are to protect property, enforce contracts, administer justice, and defend the nation. Beyond this, should not individuals be free to pursue their own interests? Doesn't too much government intervention stifle liberty and innovation? Karl Marx responds, with conviction. You speak of protecting property, but whose property, Mr. Smith? The state, in your model, protects the property of the few while denying the masses even the right to survive without selling their labor. What you call liberty is liberty for capital, not for the worker. The state, under capitalism, is not neutral. It is an instrument of class rule. Marx presses the point, leaning in. Why is it, then, that when workers organize, the state crushes them? When the poor demand land, food, or housing, the state resists, yet when banks fail or capitalists want war, the state acts swiftly. Is that impartiality, or allegiance to power? Adam Smith responds, cautiously. I understand the risk of corruption, Mr. Marx, but when the state expands too much, it becomes inefficient, even tyrannical. History warns us of governments that become oppressive when they overstep. Liberty, I maintain, is best preserved when the state governs least. Marx answers, unwavering. But who defines tyranny? A tyrant who censors speech is visible. But what about the tyranny of hunger? Of unpaid labor? Of a child born into misery with no path to rise? The worker's suffering is not reduced by the absence of the state, it is worsened when the state refuses to intervene. Smith shifts slightly, still holding his position. Yet I've seen how markets, guided by the invisible hand, can promote public good without heavy-handed control. When people act in self-interest, they often create unintended benefits for others. Doesn't this dynamic, over time, lift all boats? Marx retorts, sharply. It lifts yachts, Mr. Smith, not lifeboats. The invisible hand you celebrate is blind to justice. Capital accumulates, not because it serves the common good, but because the state enforces contracts that exploit, and laws that protect wealth, not work. There is nothing accidental about this. The state is built to defend private capital, not to liberate the masses. Smith envisioned a minimalist state that nurtures freedom, but Marx saw through that illusion. For him, a state that does not challenge private ownership of the means of production cannot be neutral, it serves capital. Where Smith trusted the wisdom of markets, Marx exposed their dependence on a state that protects inequality and punishes resistance. Final verdict, Marx wins. He reveals the state not as a referee, but as a guardian of class dominance, a structure that maintains exploitation while pretending to be impartial. Freedom and labor. Adam Smith begins, with a calm conviction. Mr. Marx, at the heart of human progress lies labor freely undertaken. When individuals are left to pursue their own interests, to trade their labor for wages in open markets, they exercise their freedom. Labor is not slavery, it is opportunity. In a commercial society, every person is the architect of their own fortune. Karl Marx raises an eyebrow, then speaks coldly. Opportunity for whom, Mr. Smith? You speak of freedom, but do not see the chains. The worker does not choose freely, he sells his labor to survive. It is not a contract between equals. It is coercion masked as liberty. What you call freedom is the freedom to be exploited. Smith responds, with earnest belief. But consider the alternative, under feudalism or monarchy, the worker had no rights at all. Capitalism, for all its flaws, replaced birthright with effort. In the labor market, a man's destiny is no longer fixed. It can be earned. Marx leans forward, voice rising. Effort. Earned. Tell me, what has the child in the slum done to deserve hunger? Why does the factory worker sweat for 12 hours and still go to bed cold? And what has the landlord done to earn rent from land he does not till, or the capitalist from profit on labor he never performs? Your market is not meritocratic. It is parasitic. Smith, slightly defensive, gestures toward social progress. And yet, look around us. Wealth has increased. Technologies have improved lives. Capitalism has produced abundance. Workers today live longer, better lives than ever before. This system has flaws, yes, but it evolves. It improves. Marx slams the table. Yes, abundance for the few, misery for the many. That is the cost of your progress. And even in comfort, the worker is alienated. He does not own what he creates. He does not decide what to make, how to make it, or for whom. He is reduced to a machine, a tool, a function, alienated from his labor, from his essence, from his fellow man. Smith asks, more quietly. So you would replace it all? Even if it risks liberty, creativity, innovation? Marx replies with steel in his voice. True liberty does not exist where survival is bought with submission. True creativity cannot bloom when labor is enslaved to profit. What I propose is not the end of work, but its liberation. From being a means of survival to a space for human fulfillment. The worker must become the owner, not a cog in a system that feeds on his life. Here, Marx strikes at the heart of Smith's liberal optimism. Where Smith sees labor as freedom, Marx reveals it as masked compulsion. The capitalist's wage is not a gift, it is a fraction of the worker's true value. Freedom under capitalism is conditional, partial, and ultimately hollow. To be truly free, the worker must no longer be a commodity, but a creator. Final verdict, Marx wins. Not by denying Smith's logic, but by exposing its limits, and by placing labor in its real, lived context, exploitation, alienation, and structural domination. Private property and capital. Adam Smith opens with firm confidence. Mr. Marx, private property is not merely a right, it is the cornerstone of civilization. It encourages industriousness, responsibility, and long-term investment. When individuals can own the fruits of their labor, they are motivated to build, save, and innovate. Without private property, how would society progress? Karl Marx responds calmly, almost amused. And yet, Mr. Smith, you confuse the fruits of labor with the fruits of ownership. The worker builds, but the capitalist owns. The laborer toils, yet the landlord profits. What you defend is not property earned through work, but capital accumulated by exploiting the work of others. That is not justice. That is theft institutionalized. Smith, defending his view, replies. But surely you cannot deny that property, land, tools, savings, allows production to take place. Capital, properly used, creates jobs and prosperity. The capitalist does take risk. Should he not also reap reward? Marx interrupts, firm and unsparing. Let us be clear, capital is dead labor that lives by sucking the blood of the living. The reward you speak of is surplus value, extracted from the unpaid portion of the worker's labor. The so-called risk of the capitalist is protected by law, by banks, by the state. But the risk of the worker? Hunger, homelessness, ruin. Private property under capitalism is not about liberty, it is about domination. Smith presses on, attempting a moral frame. And what would you have instead? No property. No ownership. That leads to tyranny. When the state owns everything, individuals become powerless. History shows us what happens when private property is abolished: disorder, stagnation, fear. Marx responds with clarity and passion. I propose not state tyranny, but collective ownership. Property in common, not in the hands of a bureaucrat, nor of a billionaire. Land should belong to those who work it. Factories to those who labor in them. Technology to those who create its value. This is not chaos, this is democracy, extended to the economic sphere. Smith reflects, with concern. But won't this kill innovation? If no one can profit from their ideas, what incentive is there to improve, to take initiative? Marx concludes, unflinching. What greater incentive exists than the well-being of all? When production is freed from profit, human creativity can serve needs, not markets. A teacher will teach, not to survive, but to elevate others. A scientist will innovate, not for patents, but for progress. Capital turns everything, land, labor, even thought, into a commodity. I seek a world where people are not reduced to things. Here, Smith clings to the moral promise of property, but Marx reveals its darker foundation, the exploitation at the heart of accumulation. Where Smith sees reward, Marx sees robbery. The debate is not about ownership, but about power, who controls the means of life, and to what end. Final verdict, Marx wins. He unmasks private property not as a natural right, but as a system of legalized theft, a structure built on inequality and sustained by state power. Competition versus cooperation. Adam Smith begins, with a confident smile. Mr. Marx, I believe competition is the invisible hand that brings order to chaos. Each individual, pursuing their own interest, unwittingly contributes to the good of all. When merchants compete, prices drop. When workers compete, skills rise. It is through rivalry, not planning, that societies flourish. Karl Marx raises his hand, interrupting softly. But at what cost, Mr. Smith? You speak of harmony, yet competition under capitalism is a war of all against all. Workers compete not for fulfillment, but for survival. Employers compete not to serve, but to dominate markets, destroy rivals, and maximize profits, even if it means cutting wages, slashing safety, or polluting the earth. Smith, leaning in, argues earnestly. Without competition, how do we avoid stagnation? Innovation comes from pressure to outperform, to improve, to create. Human beings are naturally competitive. We should channel that drive, not suppress it. Marx replies, sharply. Human beings are also naturally cooperative, yet capitalism crushes that instinct. It isolates us, atomizes us, forces us to view each other not as comrades, but as threats. The factory worker sees his peer as a rival for hours. The farmer sees his neighbor as market competition. Even artists must sell themselves. Is this progress, or estrangement? Smith objects, trying to bridge the divide. Competition does not exclude cooperation. Businesses form partnerships, nations trade, workers form teams. Is that not proof that capitalism allows both forces to coexist? Marx nods, but with irony. Yes, until profit is threatened. Then solidarity is shattered. Companies lay off workers. Governments impose austerity. Teamwork becomes obedience. The cooperation you describe is conditional, always subordinate to profit. True cooperation must be rooted in shared ownership and democratic planning. Only then does it serve the many, not the few. Smith, puzzled, asks. And who would coordinate this cooperation? Without prices to signal value, how would needs be met? Who decides how much wheat to grow, how many houses to build, or teachers to train? Marx answers with calm conviction. Not a dictator. Not a market. But the people themselves, organized, informed, empowered. Planning is not impossible. Every factory already does it internally. The problem is that planning ends at the gate. What I propose is to extend rational coordination across society, to meet human need, not to chase profit. Smith sees competition as nature. Marx sees it as design. Where Smith imagines harmony through conflict, Marx sees destruction disguised as efficiency. The clash is not about whether humans can cooperate, but whether capitalism will ever let them. Final verdict. Not because cooperation replaces all competition, but because he shows that under capitalism, competition becomes a weapon, not a tool. Real cooperation requires new foundations, collective, democratic, humane. The future of human society. Adam Smith begins, with optimism in his voice. Mr. Marx, I see in capitalism the seeds of long-term prosperity. As markets expand, wealth increases, and over time, all benefit. Civilization has moved from barbarism to trade, from tyranny to liberty. Property rights, commerce, and individual choice have tamed violence and elevated nations. This progress will continue. Karl Marx listens intently, then responds, measured and clear. Your faith is touching, Mr. Smith, but misplaced. What you call progress is a parade of crises, overproduction, underconsumption, mass layoffs. Your wealth for all arrives in crumbs for many and mountains for the few. And beneath it all, alienation grows, the worker alienated from his labor, from his fellow man, and from himself. Smith, still hopeful, counters. But look at the great cities, the inventions, the infrastructure. Wealth once unimaginable now surrounds us. Surely, with time, these benefits will trickle down. Reform is possible. Generosity is growing. History bends toward improvement. Marx replies, with steel in his voice. You mistake motion for progress. Technology should have freed us, but instead, it enslaves us to longer hours, tighter deadlines, lower wages. Your system builds machines, but breaks spirits. You praise skyscrapers, but ignore the slums at their feet. Reforms delay collapse, they do not cure it. Smith asks cautiously. Then what is your vision of the future? Without markets, what guides society forward? Without profit, what motivates creation? Marx smiles slightly, then answers. A society beyond class. Beyond exploitation. Where production serves need, not greed. Where progress is measured not in GDP, but in well-being. Where art, science, and love are no longer commodities, but human expressions. Capitalism has outlived its purpose. Its contradictions grow sharper. The future must be socialism, or barbarism. Smith sees a future shaped by gradual improvement. Marx sees a future forged by rupture. One believes in perfecting the system. The other, in overcoming it. One dreams of harmony through markets. The other calls for justice through revolution. Final verdict. He offers not just a critique of today, but a vision for tomorrow. While Smith waits for slow reform, Marx demands transformation. His diagnosis remains more accurate, his urgency more necessary. Human nature and the market. Adam Smith opens with conviction, gesturing calmly. Mr. Marx, I build my philosophy upon a simple truth: man is a self-interested being. He acts to improve his own condition. And it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we get our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. This self-love, when channeled through markets, becomes the engine of prosperity. Marx leans forward, shaking his head slowly. And there lies the tragedy. You define man by the narrowest instinct, self-interest, and elevate it to a principle. But human nature is not fixed. We are shaped by the conditions we live in. Under capitalism, people must compete to survive, so they become competitive. They must sell themselves, so they become calculating. But this is not eternal. It is historical. Smith replies thoughtfully. But if we remove incentives, how can we expect effort? If not motivated by personal gain, why would people innovate, strive, work hard? Marx responds firmly. And yet, have you never seen a teacher stay late, a nurse go unpaid, an artist work through the night, not for profit, but for purpose? Humanity is capable of solidarity, imagination, creation. But capitalism reduces all to exchange, even love becomes transaction. You mistake the effects of a system for the essence of the species. Smith pushes back. Still, self-interest is not inherently evil. When properly restrained by law and morality, it aligns personal good with social good. The invisible hand guides behavior without force. Marx answers with intensity. There is no invisible hand, only the invisible whip of necessity. Workers do not choose to sell their labor, they are forced to. They do not compete for pleasure, they compete to eat. Your freedom is a mask worn by coercion. And as long as property is concentrated, so will be power, and freedom will remain a luxury. Smith sees markets as a natural extension of human nature. Marx sees them as its distortion. Smith believes that regulating self-interest brings balance. Marx argues that true human flourishing requires the abolition of systems that reward exploitation. Final verdict. Not because self-interest is false, but because he shows it is not the whole truth. Marx expands human nature beyond greed, beyond calculation. He dares to imagine a world where cooperation is not utopia, but reality. The role of the state. Adam Smith speaks calmly, hands folded. Mr. Marx, I must remind you, the state must exist, but only in its proper limits. Its role is to protect property, administer justice, and provide for public works no private interest would fund. The market handles the rest more efficiently. Government interference, more often than not, stifles liberty and progress. Karl Marx replies, eyes sharp, voice unwavering. You describe the state as a neutral umpire, but in truth, it is the executive committee of the ruling class. It protects property because it protects capital. It upholds justice only when justice does not threaten profit. The state, under capitalism, is not above class, it is built upon it. Smith responds with cautious optimism. Surely, though, the state can evolve. With the right laws, democratic checks, and civic engagement, it can serve all citizens, not just the wealthy. Marx leans forward, voice firm. And how long must the working class wait? How many elections, reforms, and promises must pass before the machinery of the state serves the poor, not the powerful? You speak of democracy, but capital funds campaigns, owns media, shapes laws. The workers may vote every few years, but they are ruled every single day. Smith presses. But what is the alternative? A state controlled by the proletariat? That risks tyranny, the replacement of one power with another. Marx replies with fire. No, it is the birth of true democracy, not one of ballot boxes and broken promises, but one where the workers themselves administer production, education, and health. Not a state that manages exploitation, but one that abolishes it. The so-called tyranny you fear is the end of all tyrannies, the end of wage slavery, of hunger in a world of plenty. Smith envisions a minimal state, one that ensures order and lets the market flourish. Marx exposes that state as a fortress for the wealthy, an instrument of class domination. Where Smith sees reform, Marx demands revolution. Final verdict. Because he asks, who does the state really serve, and who does it silence? He doesn't settle for the illusion of democracy, he fights for its realization. Alienation and labor. Adam Smith begins, with a confident voice. Mr. Marx, you speak often of alienation. But labor is a means to an end, to earn, to produce, to participate in society. A man's work gives him value, dignity, purpose. If someone loves what they do, how can you claim they are alienated? Karl Marx responds, calm but intense. You misunderstand alienation, Mr. Smith. I do not deny that some may enjoy parts of their work. But under capitalism, the worker is separated from four essential relationships, from the product of his labor, from the act of production itself, from his species being, and from other workers. His activity becomes external, forced, and not his own. Smith counters. But markets free people to choose jobs. If one job is alienating, you can move. If people dislike their work, they can shift to others. Freedom corrects alienation. Marx replies, firmly. Freedom within chains is still bondage. The worker does not choose freely, he must sell his labor or starve. His work belongs to another. His product is taken, his control removed. The more he produces, the less he has. The more the worker spends himself, the more powerful becomes the alien world of objects which he creates over and against himself, the poorer he himself becomes. Thus the product stands opposed to him as something alien. What he makes becomes independent, a power over him. He becomes a commodity too. Smith, with hesitation, asks. Is this not an extreme view? Surely alienation is a risk, not a necessary outcome for every job and worker. Marx answers. It is the normal condition in capitalism, not the exception. Because the worker has no ownership, no control, no autonomy. His labor is external to him, it is coerced. External labor is a labor of self-sacrifice, it is forced labor. It is not voluntary, the more he produces, the poorer he becomes. Smith sees work as opportunity, Marx sees it as estrangement. Where Smith trusts that choice can cure alienation, Marx shows that the structure of work under capitalism ensures it. Alienation is not a defect, it is a symptom. Final verdict. He doesn't deny that work can be fulfilling, but he shows that under capitalism, most labor is stripped of that possibility. The debate isn't whether work can alienate, it is why it almost always does in this system. Freedom and exploitation. Adam Smith opens, appealing to liberty. Freedom is the highest good. In a free market, individuals voluntarily exchange goods and labor. No one is forced. The employer needs the worker, and the worker needs the employer. This mutual dependence fosters liberty and prosperity. Karl Marx responds sharply. Your idea of freedom is one-sided. The worker freely sells his labor because he has no other choice. He does not own land, tools, or capital. His freedom is to choose which master he will serve, not whether to serve at all. As I wrote, the laborer, instead of being protected by the law, is placed under the law of capital. Smith counters with optimism. But through saving and competition, workers can improve their condition. The market incentivizes innovation, hard work, and upward mobility. Marx replies, with clear disdain. That is the myth of bourgeois freedom, the promise that hard work alone lifts you up, while the system ensures you stay down. The worker produces surplus value, yet he only receives a fraction in wages. The rest becomes profit, stolen time, stolen life. As I said, capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor. Smith looks unconvinced. Isn't profit simply a return for risk? A reward for entrepreneurship? Marx retorts. No, it is the unpaid labor of others. The capitalist does not create value, labor does. Profit arises from exploitation, paying workers less than the value they create. You call that risk? I call it legalized theft. Smith praises freedom, but overlooks its illusion in capitalist society. Marx dismantles the fantasy, showing how exploitation hides behind contracts and wages. Where Smith sees mutual exchange, Marx reveals structural domination. Final verdict. Because he sees freedom not just as the absence of chains, but the presence of real autonomy. And under capitalism, that is a freedom reserved for the few. Value and wealth. Adam Smith begins, with clarity and conviction. Value comes from usefulness. A product's worth lies in its ability to satisfy human wants. As I wrote in The Wealth of Nations, the real price of everything is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. Exchange value arises from supply and demand, from market forces balancing themselves. Karl Marx responds, dissecting calmly. You confuse appearance with essence, Mr. Smith. The market only reflects value, it does not create it. I agree, labor is key. But not all labor produces equal value. Value is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce a commodity. The market merely masks the exploitation behind prices. Smith objects, politely. But competition regulates the market. If prices are unfair, new producers enter. Equilibrium returns. The invisible hand guides society toward efficiency. Marx answers coldly. The invisible hand is just a disguise for the invisible chains of labor. You speak of efficiency, I speak of surplus value. Workers produce more than they are paid for. That unpaid portion becomes capital's profit. And that is the origin of wealth under capitalism. Smith raises an eyebrow. Then what of innovation? Capital accumulation funds progress, technology, comfort. Wealth grows, and society advances. Marx leans forward. And who benefits? While capital grows, wages stagnate. Innovation does not serve the worker, it replaces him. Machinery amplifies exploitation, speeds up production, and expands profit. As I wrote, the increase in the value of the world of things is directly proportional to the devaluation of the world of men. Smith views value through the lens of trade and price, Marx sees beneath the surface, to labor, time, and exploitation. Where Smith trusts market harmony, Marx reveals conflict hidden in every transaction. Final verdict. Because he explains not just how prices fluctuate, but how value is produced, stolen, and transformed into profit. His theory exposes the cost behind every fair exchange. The role of the state. Adam Smith begins with measured confidence. Mr. Marx, a capable state must perform certain essential tasks: defend the nation, enforce contracts, administer justice, and build public works. But its reach should stop there. When the state intrudes into markets, it distorts incentives, stifles enterprise, and undermines freedom. Why should citizens accept a state that does more than protect their liberties? Karl Marx answers, with quiet intensity. Because your minimalist state is a myth, Mr. Smith. In practice, the state is never neutral. When it enforces contracts, it enforces inequality. When it protects property, it protects the powerful. The state under capitalism is not a neutral umpire, it is the organizer of class domination. Smith presses on. But if the state ceases to protect property and ensure security, chaos reigns. Markets need stability, law, infrastructure, without which commerce cannot function. Is not a modest state necessary to preserve the conditions for peaceful exchange? Marx counters, sharply. You assume state power serves those conditions impartially, but look at history. When workers strike, the state intervenes on behalf of capital. When capital collapses, the state bails it out, with public money. The state does not stabilize markets for the people, it stabilizes capitalism for the elite. Smith, slightly uneasy, concedes part. True, the state has been corrupted. Yet how else can society ensure education, roads, sanitation, things markets undervalue? Do we abandon those for utopian ideals? Marx replies firmly. No, we reclaim those for collective control. The state must no longer be the manager of exploitation, but the instrument of emancipation. Education, health, housing, these are not luxuries. They are rights. The state should be transformed so that workers govern the economy, not capitalists. Smith argues for a limited state that enables freedom. Marx exposes that state as complicit in oppression. Where Smith looks for peace and order, Marx sees control and coercion woven into the very institutions the state upholds. Final verdict. Because he reveals that under capitalism, the state cannot truly limit itself, it always expands to protect the interests of the owning class. True transformation demands not reform, a new state shaped by the people, not for the elite. Competition versus cooperation. Adam Smith opens with enthusiasm. Competition, Mr. Marx, is the engine of progress. When individuals pursue their own interests, they drive innovation, lower prices, and improve quality. This isn't greed, it's the invisible hand channeling self-interest into public good. Without competition, stagnation sets in. Karl Marx replies coolly. You speak of competition as progress, I see it as war. A war of all against all, where workers are pitted against each other to drive down wages, and small businesses are devoured by monopolies. Competition under capitalism creates insecurity, not harmony. Smith challenges gently. But without it, how do we motivate excellence? Would you eliminate rivalry entirely? What drives people to produce better goods or ideas, if not the desire to succeed? Marx responds with fire. There is a difference between striving to create, and being forced to fight for survival. I believe in human creativity, but competition under capitalism does not reward excellence, it rewards profit. The most efficient capitalist isn't the most innovative, but the one who pays the lowest wages and crushes the most rivals. Smith raises a hand in defense. But history shows markets lift societies. Capitalist nations have produced wealth, technology, abundance. Isn't this proof that competition works? Marx leans forward. At what cost? That wealth is not shared. That technology replaces workers. That abundance is fenced behind walls of class. I do not deny capitalism's productive power, I condemn the injustice of its distribution. Cooperation, not competition, should guide production, based on collective needs, not market chaos. Smith sees competition as a natural force for balance. Marx reveals it as a structure of conflict, of exploitation hidden under the illusion of choice. One defends rivalry, the other, solidarity. Final verdict. Because he exposes that behind every healthy competition lies a system that divides the many to benefit the few. His vision replaces market violence with democratic cooperation, not as a dream, but as a necessity. Freedom and exploitation. Adam Smith begins, with a tone of conviction. At the heart of capitalism is freedom. The freedom to trade, to work, to create. No one is forced to sell, buyers and sellers engage by choice. The laborer is free to offer his work, and the capitalist is free to accept or decline. This mutual liberty is the foundation of a just society. Karl Marx responds without hesitation. Free. A worker is free only in the sense that he owns nothing but his own labor. He is free to sell it, or starve. That is not freedom. That is coercion masked as consent. Smith, slightly unsettled, replies. But no one compels him to work for one employer or another. Isn't choice between options still a form of liberty? Marx strikes back calmly. A man who must sell his labor to survive does not choose, he obeys. True freedom means control over your life, not just permission to exist. In capitalism, the worker creates value, but sees none of it. His labor becomes alien to him. This is not freedom, it is exploitation. Smith counters, a note of idealism in his voice. Surely, a growing economy, higher wages, and rising living standards bring real improvements in life. Doesn't that count as progress? Marx answers, sharply. Progress for whom? If a billionaire's wealth grows while a worker gets a slightly bigger cage, is that freedom? Capitalism ties freedom to profit, not to human dignity. Real freedom begins when exploitation ends. When people work not to enrich a few, but to enrich all. Smith praises freedom as a market transaction. Marx redefines it as emancipation from need, from domination, from alienation. For Smith, freedom is choice within the system. For Marx, freedom means transforming the system itself. Final verdict. Because he reveals that what capitalism calls freedom is often just the freedom to be exploited. Real liberty, human liberty, begins when people have the power to shape their own lives, not just survive inside someone else's economy.